Here with all of you around the world to discuss this important issue. It's my absolute pleasure to welcome all of you to this interactive conversation with a panel of experts on moving beyond militaristic approaches to counterterrorism and how member states and the UN can work together to dismantle the barriers to civil society's participation and engagement in developing effective, do no harm, PVE and CT policies. This is an especially important topic today as the world is witnessing an increase in conflict, an increase in military expenditure around the world, and decreasing indicators on human security and gender equality right across the globe. As Natasha mentioned, this webinar is one of a series grounded in the Gender and Security Toolkit, a set of resources that was jointly published by UN Women, OSCE, ODIHR, and DCAF in February 2020. This session in particular builds on the PVE section of the toolkit, but also on the work that UN Women has been doing in partnership with CTED, OCT, and partners like DCAF and ODIHR to ensure that gender is at the fore of UN policy advice on counterterrorism and programming around PVE. In UN Women, and following our partnership in publishing the Gender and Security Toolkit, we developed relevant policies to consolidate our added value and our contribution to advancing gender equality and women's empowerment in the context of CT and PVE, within the framework of UN assistance to implementing the UN Global Counterterrorism Strategy more broadly. I also hope today's discussion will focus on the very important need to translate these policies into gender responsive practices on the ground at the country and regional level. It's my pleasure to introduce our four speakers for today's session. First, we will have Iman Saeed Taha, Policy Specialist on PVE CT at UN Women. Secondly, Noreen Chowdhury Fink, who is the Executive Director at the Soufan Center in New York. Then we have a speaker from Kazakhstan, Gulnaz Razdikova, who is the Director of the Center of Analysis and Development of Interfaith Relations. And then we will have Alexandra Dier, who is the Gender Advisor with the Counterterrorism Executive Directorate. Thank you, each of you, for taking the time to be with us today. Each speaker will talk for about 5 minutes, bringing their perspectives to effective approaches to PVE that move beyond security and militarized responses, and share what they've found to be effective and what more needs to be done, particularly by member states as the authorities responsible for security of their citizens, but also working in concert with the UN and civil society. We will also reserve some time for questions at the end, and please feel free to ask questions in Arabic, French, Georgian, and English. So the first question is for Iman. Iman, can you please tell us how government security apparatuses can add and should support participatory approaches to PVE that are not just gender responsive, but also go beyond the security sector and engage women and civil society actors?
Well, thank you so much, Sarah, and thanks to our partners also in this webinar and to participants. I'm really looking forward to the discussion today. I think in general, before we look at the issue of effective participatory approaches, we can also first start looking within the context of which this partnership is taking place. Just to examine the realities on the ground, we usually work in a context where we find the security sector institution to be a centralized institution of the state. It's usually comprised of a specific group of the society. And in that sense, it comes with a specific set of organizational culture, if you wish, that in some instances can not be representative of the society at large. It might not be as accessible in the periphery as it is in the center. And these kinds of traits that sometimes are common traits within the security institution is of course, reflected in the perception from the society and from the civil society as well, and from the community at large. So how can government efforts to increase effective participatory approaches within this context? In that sense, some work to democratize the security institution itself, whether that be broadly or the specific units looking at counterterrorism and PVE, depending on the jurisdiction. And that is to increase its representation, whether that include also women in uniform or women at the decision-making level, but also representation of different groups of the society, increase its outreach and accessibility, so it's accessible, and accountability. So in that sense, I think a prerequisite for effective participatory approaches is to look at the accessibility of the institution, its effectiveness, its fairness, the delivery of service to all, and accountability, and to what extent these are all happening. And I think without looking at these factors, it's a bit difficult for governments to have a sustained effort to increase participatory approaches. I think very important aspect also is to what extent it has coordination with line ministries. And in some instances, these ministries are the ones who have more classic partnership with civil society, including the Ministry of Social Affairs, the Ministry of Women, or the equivalent of that, Ministry of Labor, Ministry of Health, and so on. And that's an intrinsic part of ensuring that the security institution is participatory. And I think all of these elements together can then facilitate efforts to increase participatory approaches, not only with civil society, but also with the community at large. And that could be different segments of the civil society, like the bar union, different labor syndicates, and so on. So civil society at large. And that's an important aspect for effective participatory approaches. I think, on the other hand, what can make it, on the other hand, I think it's important for assistance to security sector in general to, when we advocate as the United Nations or as other international or regional partners for increased participatory approaches, to provide this kind of advocacy and assistance in a comprehensive framework of strengthening capacity, strengthening effective service provision, strengthen accountability measures, and also putting in place measures to increase trust and enhance the perception of these institutions. I think without looking into these kind of elements and features together, there could be a risk of instrumentalization when we call for participatory approaches, in the sense that there will be a participatory approach that could put to risk participants, whether they be male or female, or to instrumentalize relationships within the community or within the family. And I think for that matter, it's important, I think, from the support side, that the call and advocacy for effective participatory approaches should come within a comprehensive framework, or is matched by a comprehensive framework from the national actor side. Over.
Thank you so much, Iman. I think what really stuck out to me from your intervention was the need to really look at this as a governance issue. And I was also reminded of the studies that the UN World Bank Conflict Prevention Report, Pathways for Peace, found that actually grievance was a major reason for the outbreak of conflict, one of the key factors. And that was also, I think, echoed in UNDP's report on the extremism in Africa. So I think it's really important when we're looking at the root causes to consider the functioning of the basic services and also rule of law, that this at the end of the day is really a rule of law issue. So now over to Noreen. Noreen, if you could please elaborate on what governments and security actors can do to dismantle the barriers to partnership with and participation of civil society in PVE activities.
Thanks, Sarah.
PVE activities.
Thanks, Sarah and Natasha, and to all the organizers for having me here. It's I'm really looking forward to this discussion, and I think it's really important that we bring many of these sort of nuances back to the forefront. I think it's an issue that people often talk about, but still doesn't seem to get quite enough attention. Your question on barriers to entry in PVE, I'm going to just reframe slightly and say PVE and CT, because I think the barriers to entry will look very different depending on the kind of nuance and the kind of programming and spaces we're talking about entry, right? In PVE and a lot of the prevention work, there seems a more more of an openness and a receptivity to engaging on gender issues and engaging with women's civil society actors and partners, because the spectrum of prevention work looks a lot like efforts that are ongoing in whether it's the development space, the community organization space, the peace building space. I think in the area of sort of the harder edge of CT, part of the challenge with barriers to entry is there isn't really a recognition of the link in the first place. You know, a lot of counterterrorism and security actors still do not necessarily recognize the link between gender and counterterrorism, and thinking about the very diverse and multiple roles that women can play, and also how gender affects the CT discourse. So I think the first step in addressing that barrier to entry you've asked about is a recognition of that linkage in both the PVE space, but also the CT space. I think a second area of addressing that barrier is a deliberate outreach for a diversity of expertise. You know, quite often, and particularly in security spaces, you have sort of very traditional partners, a very sort of traditional line ministries that are generally involved on the government side, traditional security institutions involved. And I think there needs to be a very deliberate outreach to a range of experts and partnerships, whether that's different line ministries, whether that's different kinds of civil society actors, or municipal institutions. So I think that kind of deliberate intentionality to diversify the range of stakeholders needs to be there, and that's a key area in addressing that barrier to entry. And I think really that there needs to be a breakdown of the stereotype where breaking down the barrier to entry means just kind of add women to the mix. You know, we see that quite often where in an attempt to address gender issues, there is a kind of afterthought about adding some women to the table, or sort of adding some institutions at the last minute. And I think we need to move past that and make sure that this kind of discussion on addressing these barriers to entry is taking place at the beginning of program development, at the beginning of policy formulation, and continuing throughout to the implementation phase. I think that when it hasn't been taken into account at the outset of policy development, then it's very hard to integrate these issues as you go along. So I'll stop there, but as you know, I could go on forever. You're on mute, Sarah.
Sorry. Thank you so much, Noreen. And I think your intervention really underscored the need to be able to utilize really robust analysis and understanding of the gender dynamics of the situation prior to engaging in any activities, and how hard it is to actually catch up when gender is missing at the outset. So that's something that we find across the peace and security field. So now on to Gulnaz. Kazakhstan is a good example of state response to some of the more complex and politically risky aspects of response to terrorism and violent extremism. What are good practices when it comes to integrating gender into the PVE national action plans and the WPS and PVE into the WPS national action plan, and integrating gender analyses into community engagement around PVE? Over to you, Gulnaz. Thank you.
Добрый день. Добрый день. Большое спасибо за приглашение. Для меня это большая честь выступить в сегодняшней дискуссии. Я надеюсь, что дискуссия будет сегодня полезной и, самое главное, живой.
Gulnaz, can you enter the Russian channel, please?
Да, я на русском сижу.
Apologies, colleagues and participants, while we get Gulnaz's interpretation line corrected. In the meantime, should we move to the next question? Gulnaz, I'll get you settled. Sure. Thank you, Natasha, and sorry about the technical difficulties. So the next question is for Alexandra. If you could also talk a little bit about CTED's approach when it comes to involving civil society to enhance cooperation and build capacity at the national, regional, and sub-regional levels to prevent and combat terrorism, especially in the areas of criminal law, justice enforcement, and border security and management within a framework based on rule of law and the respect of human rights. Over to you, Alexandra.
Thank you so much, Sarah, and a big thank you to UN Women and all the partners involved in organizing this event today. It's a real pleasure to be part of the discussion. So in answer to this question, let me highlight two main points. I think the first one is that I think it's very important that you're raising this full spectrum of different areas and different institutions that are relevant, including the criminal justice sector, law enforcement, and others, because very often the conversation around civil society participation is limited to the kind of CVE, PVE space, the kind of more softer end of the CT spectrum. And we talk less about the importance of that participation also at the other and the harder end of CT work. And so very much the kind of the work with law enforcement, with border control agencies, with criminal justice institutions, in all of these areas, there should be consideration for the voices of civil society as well. So I think it's very important to highlight that. But then the second point that I really want to make is that talking about participation and a participatory approach is extremely important, but we shouldn't be limiting ourselves to participation as sort of the only goal, the end goal, and the silver bullet to the problems that we are trying to address. I think it is crucially important to have a more inclusive process in the counterterrorism space. But that in and of itself is not enough. We also have to be looking at, are we actually getting more inclusive outcomes? And do the voices of civil society actually shape the policies and programs that are being designed? And I think that this is something where we continue to see still very limited impact. I think it's fair to say that thanks to the advocacy work and pressure of many civil society organizations and human rights bodies and other relevant stakeholders, there has actually been some progress in the last couple of years in terms of increased pressure for counterterrorism institutions to find formats for consultations with civil society. And so we've seen an increase in these kinds of meetings and these kinds of briefings by civil society actors, both at the international level, whether that's at the Security Council or the UN's counterterrorism bodies, or in many cases at the national and regional levels. But I think we need to kind of really make sure that that is not just a kind of box ticking exercise where we can say, well, we've consulted with civil society and so now we're good. We have to really see, have we not just heard them, but actually listened to what they had to say? And have we taken those views into consideration when it then comes to actual policy decisions? And I think in that area, again, there are still huge deficits. And I think many of the concerns that civil society has been raising in the counterterrorism space are not new concerns. We've been hearing about human rights violations, discriminatory practices, exclusion, lack of democratic oversight, lack of transparency over and over again. But how much progress has there been as a result of these concerns being raised and actually changing and transforming practice? And so I really think that if we are then trying to move the conversation also to a consideration of what kind of accountability mechanisms are needed, how do we improve these structures, we need to be looking at accountability not just in terms of participation, but really sort of accountability for the outcomes that are being produced.
Thank you, Alexandra. I think you've raised a really good point about the need to remember that consultation is a process and it is not a goal in itself, and that also it's a tool, one of many tools to try to affect the actual outcomes of these CT and PVE interventions. So I think that's a really useful reminder of how we need to keep a focus on the ultimate end goal, which is to have a more transformative approach to our engagement with security actors. So let me now turn back to Gulnaz. I hope we have our translation sorted out. So I'll read the question again, just for the flow of the conversation. Gulnaz, Kazakhstan is a good example of state response to some of the more complex and politically risky aspects of response to terrorism and violent extremism. What are good practices when it comes to integrating gender into the PVE national action plans, as well as integrating PVE into women, peace and security national action plans, and integrating gender analyses into community engagement around PVE that you could share from your context?
Окей. Айша, слышно, да, меня? Так, я хочу рассказать о своем опыте превенции насильственного экстремизма у нас в Казахстане. Я работаю в Казахстане в этой области уже более 10 лет. Так, Айша, ты переводишь?
Hold on. Yes, I can. Мы только слышим по-русски. Мы не слышим по-английски еще.
Да, Наташа, давайте так сделаем. Я буду по чуть-чуть говорить, и Айша сразу будет переводить, а я замолкать. Наверное,
очень хорошо. Спасибо. So, colleagues, Gulnaz, we're having an issue with her interpretation channel. She's going to speak in Russian, and then we'll have consecutive interpretation.
She says that she wanna share about her practice about national extremism in Kazakhstan. So she works in this part about 10 years.
Многие из вас, наверное, знают, что в 2019 году наша страна репатриировала в Казахстан 749 человек в рамках гуманитарной операции «Жусан» из Сирии и Ирака.
So you know that from 2019, our country makes repatriation about 749 people from Syria and Iraq.
Из этих это были женщины, дети и мужчины.
There were women, children and men.
Около 200 женщин были возвращены в Казахстан, и я была ответственной за программы их реабилитации и реинтеграции.
About 200 women came to Kazakhstan, and she was making the reintegration and the rehabilitation of these women.
Работая с этими женщинами в течение последних 3 лет, анализируя их биографии, я пришла к очень многим интересным выводам.
Working with these people about 3 years with these women, she made some analysis and her conclusion about them.
Эти женщины у нас официально признаны жертвами терроризма.
These women officially in Kazakhstan, they are, recognized as victims of terrorism.
Несмотря на то, что они были женами и вдовами иностранных боевиков-террористов,
Even though they are women, wives and widows of terrorists,
эти женщины пережили все ужасы войны, отсутствие медицинских условий и элементарных условий для жизни.
And conveyed all the horrors of war. They had felt all conditions of war and the terrorism.
Они испытывали сексуальную эксплуатацию как форму давления и насилия. Обещания вступить в брак были беспомощными в руках этих мужчин.
So they experienced sexual exploitation from these men who said them that they can be their wives.
У многих из них наблюдались психические и поведенческие изменения.
So a lot of them observed psychological behavioral abuse from those men.
Вовлекая их в программы реабилитации, они изменили свое поведение. Вовлекаясь в программы реабилитации, они изменили свое поведение и мышление.
So involving in rehabilitation programs, they changed their minds and their activities.
Из числа этих женщин была создана волонтерская группа.
Was created from this woman volunteer group,
которые заявили, что они больше не жертвы терроризма, а борцы с терроризмом.
Who said that they are not victims of terrorism, but fighters of terrorism.
Все это делает наши программы реабилитации очень устойчивыми.
So all of this makes our rehabilitation program sustainable and better.
Это опыт Казахстана.
Повторите.
Так, опыт Казахстана позволяет на сегодняшний день провести гендерный анализ факторов радикализации этих женщин.
Kazakhstan's experience allows to make analysis of this situation.
Также необходимо учитывать, планировать медийные контрстратегии с учетом гендерных особенностей.
Must be concentrated medical considers.
И необходимо вовлекать самих женщин в проекты по превенции насильственного экстремизма.
It's necessary to involve women in projects
по превенции насильственного экстремизма.
It's necessary to involve women in projects to prevent violent extremism.
Ну, я постаралась кратко рассказать, хотя у меня есть очень много материала практического, но я готова ответить на вопросы и прошу прощения за технические неудобства.
So she briefly told about the situation, but she has a lot of material about all of this, and she can listen your questions.
Thank you so much, Gulnaz, for highlighting that experience. And I think also reminding us of the caseloads and the individuals that are being affected by this at the grassroots level. So I think it's also important to always remember the impacts that this is having on individual lives and why the work that we're doing to make these policies and initiatives more gender responsive is so important. So I'm going to turn back to Noreen for one final question from the panel, and then we will open it up. We have a few questions in the chat already, so please continue to put your questions in the chat. But let me ask Noreen one last question about how we can identify and mitigate negative downstream impacts of PVE and CT policies when state actors and policymakers don't take gender into account or fail to engage or consult with civil society in meaningful ways. So I think it's kind of the flip side of what you were just discussing in your intervention of when we are not able to influence policies and initiatives at the planning and analysis stage, how can we then mitigate that further down the road?
Sure. Thanks for ending. I think there's always an important opportunity to course correct, right? We saw for almost the first decade and a half of UN counterterrorism work, even with the sort of expanded UN task force that was forming at the time to work on multilateral CT efforts, there was nothing on gender. And then, as we know, there was a huge course correction, and gender has sort of been further integrated into multilateral CT work. So I think there's always an important opportunity to make sure that if the gender aspect is missing from PVE and CT work, that shouldn't stop advocates and practitioners for trying to find ways to retroactively integrate it and make sure that's established going forward. I think that it's also important to make sure, as many of the panelists have mentioned today, that the quest for inclusion and the quest for participation isn't the end goal, and it's not a coercive discussion, right? We also know that in a number of circumstances, that conversation can feel more unsafe and less inclusive if there are not conditions that feel very safe for that discussion. So I think making sure that efforts to integrate gender are taking place in a kind of environment where that participation is voluntary, where a lot of the safety measures for individuals taking part in these conversations is considered, where accessibility is considered. And I think also where there's more clarity and honesty about the objectives of a lot of the initiatives. We've heard a lot about the risks of instrumentalization. We've heard a lot about the risks of securitization. And I think a lot of that has to do, as I mentioned earlier, with the different kinds of actors involved in PVE and CT spaces. And I think it's important to be a bit clear about what the objectives are. So if these measures are already going forward without integrating a gender perspective, there are a number of different entry points, right? There's the policy entry point, and we saw a lot of that happening, as I said, even in the UN space and in several countries where gender was not part of their initial CT strategies or a lot of their initial sort of CT implementation planning. And that has been added in thanks to the advocacy and engagement of civil society actors, other government institutions, organizations certainly like UN Women and others. So I think that's particularly important. On the practice side, I think that there are also often opportunities not directly through the CT space, but other ways of informing it. So whether it's through the media, whether it is through education, there are other sectors where the CT work is having an impact or intersecting with other peace and security efforts. And I think ensuring that gender is thoroughly integrated into those allows a way to mitigate where there might be a lack in the CT space. I hope that's helpful.
Yeah, very helpful. Thank you. So we have a couple of questions in the chat, and I would appreciate if anyone wants to add additional questions, we can take one round, but we have two. I think the first one is also for Noreen, that is to explain the difference between soft and hard CT and PVE work in terms of CSO participation. Let me read the second one, which is why not launch courses to bring political consciousness among women on a consistent pattern so that they are able to make practical decision, they're able to practically take part in decision-making processes. And this one has come from a colleague in Indian administered Kashmir. So this is about, you know, capacity building of women's organizations and women leaders, I guess, on these topics. So maybe let me first hand to Noreen to answer the first one about soft versus hard. And then maybe we could start with Gulnaz to talk about any experiences with capacity building for local women's organizations on the ground to engage in these processes, and then go through the other panelists if, until we get more questions. So Noreen, over to you.
Thanks, Sarah. Well, I think to begin with, it's sometimes a little difficult to separate soft and hard, right? It's an oversimplification, and I want to acknowledge that sometimes the work is far more nuanced than that. There's often a mix of sort of softer preventive measures and harder, sort of more securitized measures. But I think it is, they are very different spaces in many contexts. So often in the PVE work, you have a lot of actors who are engaged in prevention approaches, whether they're development actors, community organizations, peace building actors, educators. So I think the range of stakeholders that are often involved in a lot of the prevention work on the ground tend to be the kinds of line ministries and organizations that have a much more inclusive and participatory approach. And I think prevention by its nature involves a different range of actors that are generally a little bit more open to wider participation. And it's not always the purview of the state, right? You have a lot of community-based actors, municipal actors who are involved in preventing violence, you know, addressing hate speech, addressing intolerance, working with young people to make sure community relations are better. So I think that when we think of traditional softer side of PVE, you're talking about non-security sector institutions. As I said, it's a bit more nuanced than that. I think security sector institutions certainly do prevention work and think about prevention issues. But generally in the PV space, you have a wider range of non-governmental and non-securitized actors working on PVE. I think when you're talking about traditional sort of CT, or what we would say the hard edge of the spear in some places, there's security institutions, right? You're talking about military, you're talking about police, you're talking about law enforcement, you're talking about intelligence. And those are sectors that we haven't really talked about intelligence here today. And a lot of that, that world is not always open to civil society engagement for the sensitive nature of the work they're doing, the kinds of institutional cultures there are. And that's why in my first intervention, I said that first link about participation and engagement is even recognizing that linkage between gender and CT, because for a lot of those institutions, it may not always be a given. But again, it's blurry. I've certainly talked with border security and intelligence officials who are the first ones to say, actually, we recognize that gender is a far more critical component of the work we do, sometimes than policymakers. And it's sometimes felt that policy has actually lagged behind practice because those who are engaged in the operational side of the work see the importance. But generally, security sector institutions tend to be a little harder for CSOs to penetrate. So that's what I meant by the bifurcation.
Yeah, thank you for that. Let me now hand over to Gulnaz to reflect on how to bring political consciousness and capacity building to women leaders on the ground on this topic. And then we have another question from the chat, and I'll also ask the panelists a question on my own using my privilege as a moderator, and then turn to the other panelists. So go ahead, Gulnaz.
Айша, переведешь, да?
Sarah, can you repeat the question for Gulnaz, please?
Sure. So this is a question that has come from the audience, which is why not launch courses, or I would say capacity building, to bring consciousness among women on a consistent pattern so that they are able to practically take part in decision-making processes. So this is about capacity building and training of women's organizations.
Окей. Айша, кратко переведи.
Aisha, are you there?
Айша, ты где?
Okay, should we come back to you, Gulnaz? If that's okay, I'll come back to you once we figure out the interpretation, and I'm very sorry about that. So we have another question from the chat, and then I'd also like to ask a question as the moderator, and then hand over to Iman and Alexandra to reflect on this question. So the question that came from the audience is, to what extent do we have to change mindsets of power brokers to ensure that gender is considered throughout PVE and CT work, and that these processes also become more participatory? So I think that's a very interesting question to reflect on in the context of what is the overall objective of the gender mainstreaming and participatory approaches that we're advocating for. And then I'd also like to add a question, which is, what are the benefits and risks of building partnerships between security sector and non-security bodies like development and humanitarian actors for effective PVE? So this is something maybe the panelists can also reflect on, is the benefits, but also the risks. So let me first hand over to Iman.
Thank you, Sarah and colleagues. I think first I would like to comment on the question of changing the mindset and the question of gender, and whether security actors think of gender as something that is relevant to their work. I think this is a big challenge and a continuous challenge, and the experience of people engaged in it is that, of course, it's very difficult to convince a lot of security actors, not all of them, but a lot of them, that gender is actually relevant to the work they do, and it manifests in many ways on the pragmatic side. But on the other hand, when we also look at the disconnect sometimes between the policy and the practice, there is a reason for that. And I want to start by, for example, what Noreen mentioned on how gender needs to be incorporated at the beginning of programming or assistance, or and a specific initiative. I think in general, moving beyond the tokenistic approaches, there has been a movement and advocacy for considering gender power relations, as our colleague from the OSCE just mentioned in the chat, and that brings to the fore the question of gender equality. Is gender inequality a driver of security threat or no? And then there has been a lot of work and research done confirming that inequalities in general is indeed a catalyst of threats, security threats, and gender equality is part of that. So we are still in a phase where we are in the advocacy phase, talking about how gender equality is relevant to the discussion of counterterrorism. The other aspect from the security actors perspective is that then what is the objective of the delivery of a counterterrorism policy? And here is where the nuances start. If we are talking about a purely boots on the ground military approach, this is one aspect that still needs to take an analysis, a situation analysis with a thorough gender perspective in it. But in today's world, we see CT laws affecting financing, access, a lot of aspects of civil and political rights. Hence, the actors themselves are nuanced within the counterterrorism and who enforce these laws depending on jurisdiction. Is it the law enforcement? Is it the paramilitary? Is it gendarme? What kind of jurisdiction we have? So in that sense, when we talk about taking the power relations into perspective, taking gender mainstreaming beyond participation and tokenistic measures, the conversation intrinsically leads to look at systematic gender inequalities and inequalities in a given context and make sure that responses are relevant and tailored to that specific context. And when doing so, we find that gender is definitely part of the discussion of counterterrorism or the more preventative approaches of prevention of violent extremism. And as mentioned, as Noreen mentioned, in many instances, you will see practitioners in country, in the job, who see the immediate relation of gender to the work they're delivering, whereas at the policy level, there's a huge disconnect. And in many instances, we find policies that are very aligned to international standards and include a lot of language about inclusion, about gender responsiveness. However, it doesn't trickle into implementation. And there are some cases towards that. So I think, of course, thanks to the huge work of advocacy and the work of civil society and relevant mandates, there is progress. However, there is still some work to be done. And part of that big piece is putting gender equality part of the discussion, of the security related discussion, of which counterterrorism is part of. Now, that's my comment on this aspect. And I think my comment on the benefits and risks of partnership with security sector, of course, it comes with the set of risks, including the securitization of development across the board, whether just to take the framework of the SDGs, whether engaging with the security sector from a perspective of SDG 5, gender equality, securitizing women's rights, or securitizing education, or securitizing, so that risk is there. However, because of that, it's very important that partnerships are initiated within a very transparent framework of engagement, if you wish, on the onset, because this partnership is very important. And without that partnership, that institutional capacity development is hard to come about, making it accessible, representative, diversified is very difficult without that partnership. So partnership is important. In programmatically speaking, there is no access and no delivery in country without partnership to security sector. So it's important to go into these kind of partnerships with a very concrete and transparent objective of why are we entering into this partnership? What are the deliverables of this partnership? If we can agree on couple of indicators of what are we going to measure by the end, I think there are tools that help us manage and mitigate the risk that's inherent in having a partnership with different security actors in country. Over to you.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. Alexandra, over to you.
Yeah, thank you. So let me pick up on this question around changing mindsets of power brokers, because I think that's actually a very important aspect. I think we really need to make sure that we are not putting all of this on the shoulders of women and of civil society organizations to do the work. There has to be an expectation from the other side, from those within an institutional context of power, to actually do their part and open up these structures to greater participation. And I think that what we also need to be talking about in that context, and it sort of goes back to this theme of sort of, well, participation in and of itself is not enough. I think we really need to be talking about changing institutional cultures within the CT space, and thinking about what that actually entails. And I think it entails more than increasing the representation of diverse demographics within these institutions. I think that's one part, and I think, you know, we've touched obviously on the importance of women in that respect. I think there are other important demographics that we would want to see better represented and brought into the CT space as well, and thereby diversifying also the pool of expertise that actually contributes to policymaking within these institutions. But I think, again, it goes beyond that, and thinking deeper about how do you actually change institutional and organizational cultures. And that is something that is very hard to do, and which requires a change of mindsets and of thinking about what effective counterterrorism actually looks like. And this goes back also to this issue of you know, the distinction between hard and soft CT. And I think that is not just an objective description of the kind of different spectrum of measures. I think this is also something that is very strongly normatively coded within the CT space, where we have a clear normative hierarchy that prioritizes hard security measures, that somehow implies that, well, that is sort of the real stuff. And then the soft issues, well, they are exactly, you see it in the language already, like, you know, well, they are soft, they're a little bit more optional, they are kind of, you know, that's not the heart of the issue. This is how you then perpetuate an institutional culture that prioritizes a securitized, a militarized, a masculine coded approach. And so I think we really need to be going a lot deeper into some of these issues, and really questioning also this kind of institutional and normative exceptionalism around terrorism and counterterrorism that actually means that counterterrorism has been able to exist in a space that is not subject to the same kind of democratic oversight and accountability as other areas of policymaking. And that is because terrorism has been considered as somehow this exceptional security problem that somehow trumps everything else. And so I think if we don't get at these issues, we will not be able to fundamentally change our thinking, our approaches, and the institutional frameworks within which we are working in the CT and CVE space.
Thank you for that, Alexandra. So now let me try to turn back to Gulnaz to see if we can get the interpretation working.
Так, Айша, ты слышишь, да, меня? Ты сможешь, да, перевести? Айша.
It seems that Gulnaz's interpreter is having some issues hearing or sharing her microphone. So unfortunately, Gulnaz and I are trying to work out a shared document where she can type her responses and I can read them out in English. But we're unfortunately going to have to move on to allowing panelists to continue to discuss and reflect among themselves while we're working on this issue. My apologies to Gulnaz and to colleagues on the call today. Sarah, you're muted.
Okay, thank you, Natasha. So maybe one more question. We don't have any more questions in the chat at this point. Oh wait, no, we have one more, okay, that I didn't see at the beginning. So maybe I'll add one more question to this one, and then we can go through one more round, and hopefully by the time the other panelists have spoken, we can hear from Gulnaz through Natasha, as you said. So this question is about the involvement of ministries, security, defense, or justice in the national action plans or national gender strategies. Can this enable the integration of a gender perspective in PCVE programs and projects? So basically, do we think that these different line ministries engaging in the development of NAPs, is that a good practice to enable the integration of gender perspectives? And I think that's also a part of what was being highlighted by Gulnaz in the example from Kazakhstan. And then I'll add one more question for the panelists to consider. What do we think that governments and security actors really can do to dismantle the barriers to partnership with and participation of civil society in PVE activities? So really your summation of what are the concrete steps that need to be taken by what we would call the duty bearers in this context. Let me first hand to, we'll go in reverse order. So let me first hand maybe to Alexandra and then to Noreen and Iman for your reflections.
Thank you, Sarah. Yeah, so I mean, I think I've already touched on a few things that I would want to highlight in this regard, and I really do think that sort of changing institutional cultures is something that we need to be thinking a lot more about, and gender, by the way, has a very important role to play in that, also in sort of our analysis of what is going wrong within some of these institutions, and the kind of gendered analysis of how certain notions of masculinity are prevalent within these institutions and lead to certain types of securitized and militarized CT approaches. And so I think that is also part of a gendered, a comprehensive approach to gender in counterterrorism. It's also looking inward at the CT space itself and understanding the kind of gender dynamics and gendered power dynamics within that space. So it's not only in relation to how gender manifests itself in the context of terrorism and violent extremism itself, but also within the institutional framework we have to address these phenomena. So I think that that sort of goes to show that we still have a lot more work to do in this space on the issue of integrating gender perspectives, and really kind of making sure that we don't limit ourselves to a very narrow understanding of sort of gender mainstreaming that is sort of limited to kind of just sort of tinkering a bit at the margins of things, but that really sort of is, we understand that as an approach that has real transformative potential. And that means that we need to be asking the sort of the big questions and the hard and critical questions, and not just trying to sort of add a little bit of gender language here and there to existing policies and just sort of then continue to go along with that program, but to really kind of see this also as an opportunity to rethink from scratch how we're actually going about preventing and countering terrorism and violent extremism. And so this is why I think, you know, it is sometimes gender is just being seen as this sort of like niche issue, but I do think that if done right, if really thought of in a comprehensive and holistic manner, it really has this transformative potential within counterterrorism.
Thank you, Alexandra. I think that's also a very good message to be sending to all of our partners, that we are talking about transforming security institutions to make them more responsive to the entire population. and gender mainstreaming is a tool and a strategy towards those larger objectives. So I think that's also a very important message to be sending, rather than to, you know, sort of allow us to continue to have gender equality as a niche or a boutique issue, but rather part and parcel of the core of the way that this business is done. Iman, over to you. Oh no, Noreen, you're next, sorry.
Thanks, Sarah. And thanks for asking this question about concrete steps. I think it's really important to think about it because there's been a lot of rhetoric over the last decade, and we've seen a lot of language change, at least. I mean, that's one positive thing, but we've seen a lot of rhetorical change about gender, and we haven't really seen some concrete steps. So a few thoughts. One is that we really need on the government side and institutional side far more integrated approaches. We've all seen that, when you have WPS conversations and you have CT conversations, they're two completely different communities. Even just sitting in New York, you see that, but certainly in many, many governments, that is the case. And so if you don't have integrated approaches, all the knowledge, all the experience, all the concerns, and all the sort of risk mitigation strategies all stay within that one community. And so we really need to think about more concrete ways to break down some of these institutional silos so that you don't kind of have people preaching to the converted, and you actually are in a position to change the mindsets of those who are not comfortable. So I think more integrated approaches and platforms within governments and international organizations is particularly key. Another concrete step is actually reviewing working practices and making sure that there are built-in valves for change. A lot of times, as we know in organizations, systems and processes are set up and they're very difficult to navigate to allow for new topics, new actors to come and engage. And so I think a thorough review of working practices to make sure that you can build in a gender component or allow in different actors into policy making or policy development spaces is key. I think another concrete issue is recruitment and retention, and not just of women, but sort of gender experts, gender champions, and the kind of resource allocation that requires. I mean, far too often we see in many organizations, I'm getting really into the nitty gritty, but I think that's part of the challenge, right? There isn't money and resource allocation to make sure these issues can be covered. So in the CT space, for example, gender doesn't really get a high budgetary or personnel allocation. So I think there's some real issues there with recruitment, retention of expertise, and certainly that takes on a very different color when you're looking at law enforcement and military, where recruitment and retention of certainly women and gender experts tends to be very challenging. Another concrete step to address some of those barriers you talked about and how do we actually, sort of break down those barriers is really thinking about physical spaces and communications from an access point of view. A lot of times where and when these meetings take place make them very inaccessible. The communications are not clear, they don't reach the right audiences. So a lot of the barriers to entry may not even be intentional. It may be for lack of thinking through accessibility points, communication strategies, target audiences, things like that. And I think finally, a really important concrete measure to thinking through these barriers to entry and sustained engagement is assessing impacts. That is very rarely done in the CT PVE space. It continues to be a weakness of many policies and programs to really assess the impact and understand better both the negative impacts of policies and the positive impacts and value added of certain measures. And there's very little good assessment out there of a lot of PVE strategies and programs. And I think that helps make the case and deepen understanding for what's working and what doesn't, so that it moves beyond sort of this esoteric conversation and one that you can take to address some of the issues I mentioned earlier, from resource allocation to personnel to recruitment. Having really thorough impact assessments and a knowledge base will also help address some of those issues. So I went a little into the weeds there, but I think it is important to think about how to operationalize many of these principles we're talking about here, because that's where the weakness is. The rhetoric has gotten better, the practice remains quite weak.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. And I think that's exactly the point of the question, is to try to get into the weeds of what are the concrete steps and recommendations that we are trying to make here to different actors. So Iman, over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Sarah. I think I will also follow the track of going into the details. I think that issue of course, everything starts with a political will and a sustained political will and leadership. And yesterday, Sarah, you were on the webinar about coordinating for gender equality, and there was a lot of discussion about leadership. Leadership is very important, and they sustain the political will to do all of these implement these gender responsive policies when they exist, and when they don't exist, they can support initiating them. So the issue of representation inside the institution is really huge. And this is, of course, is a recruitment issue. It's a capacity building issue, but it's really about the representation inside these institutions, and to what extent they represent the people they serve, whether that be, again, talking about from a pragmatic perspective, in the center? Is it in the periphery? Is it away from where is it the only provider of service provision in the area? Are the people serving in these institutions representative of the community they serve directly? So it's not only about just recruiting women, but having this intersectional approach. The other issue of women in uniform or recruiting women, we've seen in the past, there was a webinar last week where border security guards, women who talk about, while they are in the force, but they're not in decision-making posts, and they get overridden all the time by their decisions all the time by their male colleagues. And so that's another issue when we talk about representative institutions. It's who do they recruit, and at what position do they recruit? Is it a recruitment that reflects the representative of the community, including from the gender perspective, and also from the origin perspective, from the language perspective? So the recruitment is a big aspect. Investing in capacity building is a big perspective. It's a big component of increasing representation as well. Also, removing barriers include placing measures, trust building measures, and trust building measures include placing accountability or accountability platforms, including access to remedy that is accessible, that is functioning, that's promulgated, that's transparent. And as you said, Sarah, these issues are intrinsically governance issues. So it's a full circle when we talk about how can we move from gender responsive, gender transformative approaches, but how can these gender transformative approaches support the democratization of these institutions through representative recruitment, through responsive gender service provision, because the service provision aspect is a big stance that is not perceived sometimes by the community. In many instances, we see the community thinking of the security actor as law enforcement, regardless of which part of the security they are, rather than providing security services to the people. I think on the other hand, there needs to be a good investment and allocation of resources to roll out good policies. We've seen in many instances where there are provisions, including affirmative actions, they might not get rolled out because of lack of resources, or an abrupt stop to the investment in gender responsive approaches. So there needs to be a sustained kind of investment. And again, that's a leadership question. I agree also on the point of monitoring and evaluation. Are our services effective in delivering on the security, on the security? Are they effective in line with international standards and respecting the human rights, or do we need to review how we do things and then roll it out? So this aspect of monitoring evaluation is actually intrinsic to accountability. I would like to come again to the point of coordinating with Line Ministries. And that is because the security institution cannot deliver on some of the some of the needs that in some places that it's only the security who represents the state, and think about context with limited state authority. So part of increasing that trust measure is through this coordination with line ministries and civil society. I think there are also good practices where we've seen security institutions reach out, come up with a proactive stance where they reach out, for example, to the local authority and through that to the civil society and community to establish dialogue platforms to exchange discussion about security situation and whatnot. But most importantly, it's a peace infrastructure in the sense that it helps the community see the security institution as accessible, and there's a learning curve for the security institution on the other hand. So I think these are all steps that some of them, not all of them at once, we will find in different contexts that provide a pragmatic approach to what could be done. And these practices are out there, are well documented. And I will come back again to the point of sustained political will through leadership that can actually see the implementation of some of these steps. I want to just comment quickly on whether involving security actors in the development of women, peace and security NAPs, will that increase gender transformative approaches? What I would like to say, linked to my previous question about answer about the risks linked to engaging with the security actors, there are risks linked to this partnership that needs to be outlined very clearly before entering into a partnership. But I think what can actually work even more effectively is engaging line ministries who usually hold the pen in developing the WPS NAPs, them being engaged with the security sector in developing their NAPs. For example, who developed the PVE NAP? That's just one example. And then on the counterterrorism side, what are the policy frameworks and mechanisms in country to do the counterterrorism part? And are these mechanisms open to bring in the line ministries who usually hold the pen on the WPS NAPs? And I think that will be a better way of bringing gendered approaches, if you wish, to the work of the security actors, rather than bringing the security to the WPS space, which is a human rights framework on what the state should do in terms of commitment to ensure the rights of girls and women in certain contexts.
Okay, thank you so much for that, Iman. I think that was a very comprehensive approach and also a very clear analysis of some of the risks and how we have to mitigate them. So now, with again, apologies for the difficulties with the interpretation, I'm going to ask Natasha to please read the responses that Gulnaz provided, which have been translated into English for her to read. Go ahead, Natasha.
Thank you so much, and with apologies again for the interpretation issues. So in relation to the question that was just being addressed, Gulnaz says, yes, in Kazakhstan, there is a state program to counter religious extremism and terrorism, in which it is written, the strengthening the role of women in security, defense, law enforcement, and emergency sectors, including at the decision-making level, building zero tolerance for violence against women and girls in conflict situations, and creating and maintaining a safe environment for women and girls. She also reflected on the previous question asked of her regarding the building of capacities of women and women's civil society to engage effectively in these processes. She says, yes, we have women's organizations that deal with prevention of extremism. They help women in employment, social security, vocational guidance. They launch business projects. Women's organizations work with Muslim women in mosques, with women who are serving sentences in prisons, and also with the wives of those who are in prison. All of these groups are considered vulnerable and very sensitive. The difficulties are associated with the cultural characteristics of the countries of Central Asia, where it is historically developed so that the woman was not the only person who made the decision. Now, of course, the situation has changed, but nevertheless, the activity of women's organizations is very low. In our country, politicians who make decisions are mostly men. They do not always take into account gender characteristics in the prevention of violent extremism. But for women's voices to be heard in the country, there must be a mature civil society and active women's organizations. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Gulnaz. That was a really excellent point, and I also think a very good moment, note to start to wrap up this very important discussion that we've been having, because I think from UN Women's perspective, we would always want to advocate for the very strong support to women's organizations as a short-term answer, but also as a long-term solution to address all of these security and development challenges that are being faced by many countries around the world. So we have just a couple of minutes left. I don't know if any of the panelists have anything else to add. You could jump in if there's any last final thoughts. But I think that we've heard, oh, go ahead, Noreen.
Hey, Sarah. Well, you had asked earlier about some of the risks and some of the risks of engagement. And we've talked a lot about the risks to civil society organizations. But I thought it's just worth thinking a little bit for those who ask civil society organizations and women's groups to engage in these discussions, what some of those risks really look like, right? Because there's a big push for engagement, for cooperation and partnerships, but it's not always clear from the those asking for the partnership that they understand how it feels or what some of the risks, we're hearing about. First, a lot of folks are worried that partnership with the security sector, partnership with the government means information sharing, and information sharing with very uncertain consequences when you're talking about CT issues and national security issues, right? So asking civil society organizations or individuals to share that information, it's a huge ask. And I don't think that those in power often appreciate the sensitivities and risks that go with that request for information sharing. We know in many contexts that the partnership brings with it the risk of insecurity because it brings exposure, it brings greater interaction with institutions or actors who are not always happy about it, whether they're in government or non-state groups who are, who will target those who partner with the government. So addressing the risk of insecurity, I think, is really key. And then also there is that risk not only of instrumentalization of civil society organizations, but that the partnerships with diverse stakeholders actually enable continuing predatory behaviors by government, right? That's another huge risk. And that's something partners need to think about whether they want to engage in this discussion or these policy spaces, is whether engagement is going to lead to a better outcome and a more transformative outcome like others have talked about today, or whether it will continue to perpetuate a much more abusive government, or sort of the misuse of CT measures, which we've seen in many states where CT has been sort of misused to target human rights defenders and others. So I think when we're thinking about the risks of partnership, we need to think about some of those aspects too, because that's where the reluctance to engage and the reluctance to partner up with government is also coming from. So I just wanted to add.
Thank you so much. Anything else from any of the panelists, or can we move? We're at the 10:30 mark. And I think we've had a lot of food for thought from all of these presentations, as well as the excellent questions that were provided by the participants. We have a lot of work to do in this field, but also I think we bring a lot of experience from other aspects of the Women, Peace, and Security agenda, of the need to promote women's leadership at the grassroots level, the need to ensure gender analysis at the very onset of processes, And also, I think the need to use our mandates and forums and everything to really hold decision makers accountable at all of the different levels. So thank you so much for those very concrete suggestions that we've had from the participants and the panelists and through the questions. As a reminder, I'd like all of you to please, if you can complete the webinar survey that will be shared with you. And this will also allow you to, hear announcements from upcoming events. And also, maybe Natasha, you could quickly tell them where oh, there's the link. And also this will allow us to share the recording with you and the other information of upcoming events. I'd like to also thank our partners in this endeavor, DCAF and OSCE, as well as Monash University, for the information and analysis that they've provided. And thank you, all of you, for your participation, and looking forward to many future discussions on this topic.
Thank you,
so
everyone.
much.
Thank you,
Bye.
everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Bye, thank you.